Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Wednesday, Yom Revi'i. Let's light up the darkness with a new wisdom candle. There we go. Who's in the house on a Wednesday? Nancy in North Carolina, Paul in the Great Northwest, Joe in the Inland Empire, Shandora in the Bronx, Bill in mid-Missouri. Looking forward to some holiday festivities, and may it be a sweet and uplifting holiday for you. Paul and all who celebrate. Paul in Chicago, Bella in Florida, Sharon never got an alert, but Lebanon, New Jersey in the house. Lucy in Minnesota, Guy in Ohio, Marjorie in Georgia, Ella, and Melissa in Great Neck. Welcome, everybody. Our daf, just a little verklempt. I posted a picture, actually, from the color suite where we're doing the color grading, or completed it today, on our film Guns and Moses. So tomorrow we'll be doing ADR. That stands for automatic dialogue replacement. And sometimes in production, you record some dialogue. There was some noise outside, the actor moved away from the microphone, something went wrong, or sometimes we change dialogue during the post-production process. We need the actor to do the line a little bit differently, things like that. So we're having, I think, 6 members of our cast tomorrow, 3 on Monday, and then we're doing loop group on Tuesday, and just getting our ducks all in a row for when we go into sound mixing in a few weeks. So that's what's going on with Guns and Moses. Our daf is page 28 here in Tractate Bava Metzia, the 22nd volume of the Talmud. Continuing our discussion of Mishna number 6. Yeah, Mishna number 6 here in chapter 2. And at the end of yesterday, we were trying to ascertain, is the law that we return a lost object to its owner, if the owner can provide distinguishing marks, right? He can tell you what the object looked like, something distinct about it that presumably only the owner would know, then you can return it to him. In other words, we're establishing ownership of the lost object, which is something that, when we talk about monetary matters, normally to establish a matter requires the testimony of witnesses. But that's obviously not always possible, and we want to fulfill the mitzvah of returning the lost object. So if the owner comes forward and can describe, what the object looks like with specificity, then we turn it over to him. So that's the law of distinguishing marks. And the question is that the law by Torah law or by rabbinic law? Right? And the reason that matters is in monetary matters, it doesn't matter. We follow the law, whether it came as a result of a rabbinic ordinance or as a result of actual Torah law. But in ritual matters, like establishing a divorce that dissolves a marriage, and a marriage only becomes a marriage by Torah law, so we wouldn't want to dissolve a marriage by rabbinic law, right? And so with the case we were talking about, is that a husband wants to divorce his wife. He writes out the get. He's going to deliver it to her by means of an agent. He can do that. But the agent loses the get en route to deliver it to the wife. And then somebody finds the get, says, I found a get. And the agent who lost it comes forward and he says, well, the get that I was taking, from my principal to his wife, looks like such and such, has their names in it, etc. And so provides the distinguishing marks. So if we return it to him, and it's by rabbinic law that we return it to him, and then he goes and presents it to the wife and she's divorced, it can create a suffix, a doubt whether the divorce is valid or not. Whereas if returning the lost object by virtue of it being identified by distinguishing marks that the owner can provide, is actually by Torah law, then he can freely give the get to the woman and the divorce is guaranteed valid. So we're trying to establish, is distinguishing marks by Torah law or rabbinic law? And a bunch of different proofs that it is by Torah law have been presented and rejected in the Gemara. And then a proof that it is by rabbinic law, that's been rejected. And so we haven't solved this yet. We continue near the bottom of page 27b. Rava said to Rav Safra, continuing yesterday's conversation, that there the obligation to return the promissory notes to the creditor, when we had, in other words, we looked at those two cases earlier in this tractate of if one found three promissory notes that were bound together. So if they were promissory notes that three different borrowers who all borrowed from the same lender, we would return them to the lender, right? They must have been in his possession. Or if we have three promissory notes that are all one borrower borrowing from three different lenders, so then we would return those promissory notes to the borrower. Why were they all together? It must be that they belong to this borrower. So discussing that, the obligation to return the promissory notes to the creditor, right, in a case where there are three different borrowers and one creditor, and the notes were all bundled together, so we return it to the creditor. And the obligation to return it to the creditor is not on the basis of distinguishing marks. It's not that the creditor came forward and said, well, the promissory notes that I lost look like such and such. Rather, it is based on logical reasoning. If one found three promissory notes relating to the loan of one debtor who borrowed money from three different creditors, he shall return the documents to the debtor, because a group of several documents indicating that one debtor borrowed money from several creditors is typically found with the debtor and is not typically found with a creditor, as the only element common to all the documents is the debtor. So conclude from it that the group of documents fell from the debtor while they were in his possession. So if one found these promissory notes relating to the loans of three debtors who borrowed money from one creditor, we return the document to the creditor, because a group of several documents indicating that multiple debtors borrowed money from a single creditor is typically found with the creditor and is not typically found with one of the debtors, as the only element common to all the documents is the identity of the creditor. Now we're on 28a. So the Gemara asks, but there is that which we learned in that Mishna on page 20a, that if one found a roll of documents or a bundle of documents, he shall return the documents to the one for whom they were written, i.e. the creditor, when he describes the roll and the bundle. These are distinguishing marks. So or identifying marks. If one returns lost items on the basis of distinguishing marks, due to the tacit agreement of the owners, meaning not by Torah law and not even by rabbinic law, but rather sort of for the benefit of the community, everyone agrees that it would be better for lost objects to be returned under these circumstances. Well, is it satisfactory? So if one found the roll of documents or a bundle of documents, he shall return the documents to the one for whom they were written, i.e. the creditor, when he describes the roll and the bundle, which serve as distinguishing marks. Now, would one say that so too, if one returns lost items on the basis of distinguishing marks due to the tacit agreement of the owners, that it is satisfactory to the debtor to have the documents returned to the creditor? The risk there is that the debtor paid back the loan and then received his promissory note, and then he lost it, and then the promissory note was returned to the creditor, who maybe isn't keeping track of who he's lent money to and who's paid him back. Now he's got a promissory note in his hands. He's going to go try and collect again. That's the problem. So rather, Rava said, identification of an item on the basis of distinguishing marks is by Torah law, as it is written, and if your brother be not near you and you know him not, then you shall bring it into your house, the lost object, and it shall be with you until your brother claims it. We're translating it as claims. The word is derosh, and you shall return it to him. Now, would it enter your mind that he would give the lost item to him before he claims it? How can the finder return it if he does not know the identity of the owner? Rather, the verb derosh is not referring to the claim of the owner. It is referring to the scrutiny performed by the finder. We talked about this yesterday. You find a lost object. You proclaim you found, let's say, a cloak, right? I found a cloak. Now, the owners will come, people who have lost their cloaks will come forward and say, okay, I lost a cloak. It looks like such and such. So if it matches the description of the one that was found, you can give it to that guy. And if it doesn't match the description, you don't. But you need to basically, now that you are the custodian of this found object, you need to investigate and ask questions and make sure that the guy who's coming to claim the cloak isn't some sort of swindler, right? So the verb derosh is not referring to the claim of the owner. It is referring to the scrutiny performed by the finder. Scrutinize him, darshehu, to determine whether the claimant is a swindler or whether he is not a swindler. Only then may you return the lost object to him. And what? Is it not that the one who claims the lost item proves that he is not a swindler? How does he prove it? On the basis of distinguishing marks that he provides. So Rava affirms, conclude from it, that identification of an item on the basis of distinguishing marks is by Torah law, because the Torah is saying that you need to scrutinize the people who come forward claiming that they are the owner of the lost object. How are you going to scrutinize them? Because they're going to provide distinguishing marks. Now, Rava begins his statement and says, if you say that identification of an item on the basis of distinguishing marks is by Torah law, and the Gemara interrupts and says, what do you mean, if you say? Didn't Rava just say that he resolves the dilemma and concludes that the identification of an item on the basis of distinguishing marks is by Torah law? Why is he going to introduce his discussion of that with if you say? That's what he believes. And the Gemara answers, Rava phrased the statement, his statement, conditionally, saying if you say, due to the fact that although he, Rava, holds that identification of an item on the basis of distinguishing marks is by Torah law, one could reject his conclusion and say, as we explained previously, yesterday, that when the Mishna states that the finder scrutinizes whether this claimant is a swindler or not, he does so not on the basis of distinguishing marks, but rather he says, bring a witness or bring witnesses, right? You claim this cloak is yours. Bring me two witnesses who've seen you wearing it and can say, yeah, that cloak that you found belongs to this guy. We don't know for sure that scrutinize the claimant means that we give it back to him if he can prove by providing distinguishing marks that it is his. Maybe scrutinize means he has to provide witnesses. The Gemara resumes Rava's interrupted statement. If you say that identification of an item on the basis of distinguishing marks is by Torah law, then in a case where an item is found and two people claim it as theirs, right? That's where the custodian of the found object really has to scrutinize the claimants. Where am I? And two people claim it as theirs, and one of them describes distinguishing marks on the item, and the other one describes distinguishing marks on the item, then what do? They both say it was mine, and this is what it looks like, and these are the unique features of that item, and they're both correct in the distinguishing marks that they've provided. So then who do you give it to? You can't know which one it belongs to. Neither one brought witnesses, and neither one provided unique, and both of them were able to provide distinguishing marks. So what do? Says Rava, when both of them provide distinguishing marks, the one who found it shall keep it in his possession and not give it to either claimant. In a case where one person describes distinguishing marks on the item and the other one brings two witnesses to support his claim of ownership, then you give it to the claimant with witnesses. In a case where one person describes distinguishing marks on the item and the other one describes distinguishing marks on the item and brings one witness to support his claim of ownership, the one witness is as one who is not there. One witness is meaningless. If you're going to establish something according to witnesses, you need two witnesses. One witness, it's like you didn't bring a witness at all. There, what you really just got is two people who say, these are my distinguishing marks. And we already said that in that case, the finder just keeps it. because you don't want to give it to a swindler. Better you should keep it than give it to a swindler. Now, one of those guys is probably telling the truth, and he's out of luck. So the testimony of a single witness has no legal standing. Now, in a case where one claimant to a found garment brings witnesses, plural, who testify that the garment was woven for him, and the other claimant brings witnesses who testify that the garment had fallen from him, right? So one person brings witnesses who say, we know that this garment was made for this person. He owned it at one time. And the other guy brings witnesses who say, we saw that garment fall from this person. Okay, so they both have witnesses, but the two claims are different in terms of what the witnesses are saying. Then what? Well, as we say that perhaps the one for whom it was woven sold the garment and it fell from another person who is the current owner. So presumably you give it to the one whose witnesses say he had it more recently. If one claimant provides particularly when it fell from him, right? That would be the dispositive testimony. Now, if one claimant comes and provides as the distinguishing marks, the measure of length of a lost garment, and the other claimant comes and provides the measure of its width, then what do you think? Is one of these testimonies more compelling than the other? Answer is yes. Which one? Hey, isn't this funny? So witnesses come and say, well, that garment matches what we know to be the length of John's garment. And the other witnesses come and say, well, that witness matches what we know to be the width of Tom's garment. So who's going to get it? John, whose witnesses testify as to the length of the garment, or Tom, whose witnesses testify as to the width of the garment? So interesting. And here's the answer. The garment shall be given to the claimant who provided the measure of its length, as one can approximate the measure of its width when its owner dons the garment and stands. But the measure of its length cannot be approximated in that manner. Therefore, it is a more clear-cut, distinguishing characteristic. Isn't that interesting? You can look at a person and have a better idea just by looking at him what is the width of the garment, right? You can tell just by looking. You can tell somebody's waist easier than you can tell the length of the inseam. So something that's just visible from a distance is not as clear-cut distinguishing feature as something that you can't tell by looking at it. And if you know it, it's because you have more firsthand knowledge that this belonged to that person. If one claimant provides the measure of its length and the measure of its width, and the other provides the measure of its gamma, this is the combined length and width, which together form the Greek letter gamma, but does not provide each measure individually, then the item shall be given to the claimant who provided the measure of its length and of its width separately. Again, these witnesses have more first-hand ready knowledge of, what this person owned or didn't own. And so we believe their witnesses and give the item to that claimant. If one claimant provides the measure of its length and the measure of its width, and the other provides the measure of its weight, then the item shall be given to the claimant who provided the measure of its weight, right? He knew the weight. How did he know the weight? Must be that this is really the case that belongs to him, which, because it is more difficult to approximate just by looking at it, is a more clear-cut distinguishing characteristic. Bava continues, in a case where a get, a bill of divorce, is found and it is unclear whether it has been delivered to the wife, and the husband who reconsidered states the distinguishing marks of the bill of divorce and claims that he did not yet give it to his wife, and the wife who wants to be divorced states the distinguishing marks of the bill of divorce and claims that she already received it, then the document shall be given to the wife. Now, this is a case where it's obvious, it's clear that both the husband and the wife would know what the get looks like. Doesn't matter that the names are in it, right? Here, what's important is the distinguishing characteristics. Well, the husband had it written up. Why would the wife know exactly what the get looks like? Because she received it. So why is the husband here saying that he never gave it to the wife? Because perhaps he divorced her, and now that she lost the get, he's thinking, oh, well, maybe, you know what, I don't want to be divorced from her, and this is my opportunity to act like we were never divorced. And so he says, no, I never gave it to her, right? And so the get, I dropped it, just give it back to me. We're not divorced. But if she says, no, we were divorced, and these are the distinguishing characteristics of the get, we believe her and we give her the get back. She needs it so that, you know, she can prove that she is divorced when she's going to go and remarry. We give it to the wife. So the Gemara asks, with what distinguishing mark did she describe the get? If we say that she described it with the measure of its height and its width, that is not a clear-cut distinguishing mark. Perhaps while her husband was holding the bill of divorce, she saw it, although he had not yet given it to her. Rather, it must be that she says that there is a perforation alongside such and such a letter in the document, which she would know only if the bill of divorce had been in her hand. In a case where the husband states the distinguishing marks of the string with which the get is bound, and she states the distinguishing marks of the string, then the document again shall be given to her. They both have equal knowledge of the distinguishing marks. Why does she have it? Because it must have been given to her, so we give it to her. When it was lost, we return it to her. And the Gemara asks, with what distinguishing mark did she describe the string? If we say that she described it by saying that the string is white, or by saying that it is red, this cannot be the mark based on which she proves her ownership, as perhaps while the husband was holding the bill of divorce, she saw the string. Rather, it must be that she stated the measure of the length of the string which binds the get, as the string was wrapped around the document, and she would know its length only if the bill of divorce had been in her hand. In a case where the husband claims that the get was not given to the wife, and he states that it was stored in a case, right, like some kind of a container, a valise, a briefcase, something like that. And the wife claims that she received the get, and she states that it was stored in a case. Then the document shall be given to the husband. What is the reason? Identification of the document based on its storage cannot prove her ownership, as she knows that he places any valuable item that he has in his possession in that case. So this is not proof that it has already been given to her, and so we give it to him. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 6. Here comes Mishnah number 7. And somebody, I forget who, asked this question yesterday. Mishnah number 7. And until when is one who finds a lost item obligated to proclaim his find? Now, it's not exactly what was asked yesterday. I think yesterday you asked, well, okay, you announced that you found a lost object. When, can you assume that no claimant is coming forward and you can just keep it for yourself? This is a related question. Until when is one who finds a lost item obligated to proclaim his find? Right? So it's not just once. And how do you proclaim it? Like, what does it mean? Okay, you proclaim your find. Does that mean you step in front of your house and you say, I found a cloak, and maybe nobody's walking by? Did you fulfill your obligation to proclaim that you found a lost object? And if you only did it once, the day you found it, have you fulfilled your obligation to proclaim the lost object? No, your obligation is greater than that. And until when is one who finds a lost item obligated to proclaim his find? He is obligated to do so until the moment that the neighbors will know of its existence, right? It has to get out there into the public knowledge, right? Until the moment that the neighbors will know of its existence. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda says he is obligated to proclaim his find for 3 pilgrimage festivals and for 7 days after the last of the pilgrimage festivals, so that its owner will have time to go to his home, a trip lasting up to 3 days, and ascertain that he in fact lost the item, and he will return to Jerusalem, a trip lasting up to 3 days, and proclaim his loss for 1 day. Now we're getting some insight, right, into how much is at stake with lost objects, right? We said that the minimum value of an object that you have to proclaim its loss is 1 penny, and that's the law. But you can see that in terms of when we're evaluating whether somebody despaired of recovering something, right? Like if somebody says, I found a cloak, right? And then somebody else says, I'm not sure if I lost my cloak or not. Or let's say he didn't hear that proclamation. He came to Jerusalem, he went back home, and when he got home is when he realized that cloak that he used in Jerusalem and that got a little dirty, and so he put it in his luggage, and then he was expecting, and then when he got home and unpacked, it's like, oh my gosh, it's not here. I must have dropped it in Jerusalem. I can't do without that cloak. I'm going to walk for 3 days back to Jerusalem and announce, I lost my cloak while I was here. Did anyone find it? Right? So you have to give that guy enough time to get home, realize he lost it, and come back. Now, you're thinking, well, I found something when I was on a pilgrimage in Jerusalem. Do I have to stay in Jerusalem for an extra 4 days? An extra week? How do I have to really go that far out of my way to return this lost object? And that's why they say you can announce it on different pilgrimage festivals, right? You found it, you went home, you took it home, you took care of it. Then you found it during Pesach. So at Shavuos, a few months later, you return to Jerusalem, you announce, when I was here, Pesach, I found the cloak. Anyone who lost a cloak at Pesach, come see me. And maybe the word will spread, hey, there's a guy who found a cloak, go see him. That kind of thing. Are we really going to go through all that trouble for an item, that was dropped in a place where multitudes pick it up and it wasn't worth that much? Probably not. But if it was very valuable and if it had distinguishing marks, then somebody will go to the trouble to try to get it back. Okay, that's the Mishnah. Now the Gemara. The Mishnah teaches that one must proclaim his find until his neighbors will know of its existence, right? That was the view of Rabbi Meir. So Atana taught, one must proclaim his find until the neighbors of the lost item will know of its existence. The Gemara asks, what is the meaning of the expression, neighbors of the lost item? If we say that the reference is to neighbors of the owner of the lost item, well, he need not proclaim his find, as if the finder knows who lost the item, let him go and return it to him. So the Gemara answers, rather, the reference is to the neighbors of the place where the lost item was found, right? So where you found this lost item, you go around and the people who live right in that neighborhood, you say, hey, I found something. Did anybody drop it? No? Okay. But now all the people in that neighborhood know that somebody who came through here found it. And he says, okay, well, if you hear who lost something, send him to me, and I live in, Bnei Brak. So if he's looking for this lost item, he can walk for a day and come see me in Bnei Brak and ask, and then if he can, provide the distinguishing marks, I'll give it back to him. Now, the guy who lost it might figure out where he lost it. He'll go back. He'll ask around in that neighborhood. The neighbors will say, oh, yeah, you lost this thing. There was a guy who found it. He lives in Bnei Brak. You can go get it from him there. So you can see how the system would work. Now, the Mishnah teaches that Rabbi Yehuda says the finder is obligated to proclaim his find for 3 pilgrimage festivals and for 7 days after the last of the 3 pilgrimage festivals, so that its owner will go to his home, a trip lasting up to 3 days, will ascertain that he in fact lost the item, and will return to Jerusalem, a trip lasting up to 3 days, and then he will go around Jerusalem proclaiming that he lost something, and hopefully, he will link up with the person who, or someone who knows who found. So apropos Rabbi Yehuda's calculation of 3 days as the duration of a pilgrim's travel from Jerusalem to his home, right? This is all when the Holy Temple was standing in Jerusalem. And on the festivals, right, Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot, people would come from all parts of Israel to Jerusalem. So Rabbi Yehuda is saying, okay, well, it took 3 days to get from anywhere in Israel to Jerusalem. Is that so? The Gemara raises a contradiction from a Mishna in Tractate Tainus, page 10a. On the 3rd of the month of Mar Cheshvan, also known as Cheshvan, which is the month after Tishrei. Tishrei is the month of Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot. The next month is Mar Cheshvan. So on the 3rd of the month of Mar Cheshvan, one starts to request rain by inserting the phrase, and grant dew and rain in the blessing of the years, as part of the Amidah, right? The Shemona Esrei, the prayer that we say 3 times a day. It changes seasonally, right? So this is the date on which in the fall we start to ask God for, rain, that rain should come during the rainy season so that we don't have a famine. So why is that relevant? So on the 3rd of the month of Mar Cheshvan, one starts to request rain by inserting that phrase in the Amidah prayer. Rabban Gamliel says, one starts to request rain on the 7th of Mar Cheshvan, which is 15 days after the conclusion of the festival of Sukkot. Right? Sukkot begins on the 15th of Tishrei, so it ends, right? It's an 8-day festival. Sukkot ends after 7 days, but Shmini Atzeret is linked to it, so after 8 days. That would be now the 23rd. And then, 15 days after that is going to be the end of the first week of Mar Cheshvan, so the 7th. And why does Rabban Gamliel say that we start to request rain on the 7th of Mar Cheshvan, which is 15 days after the conclusion of the festival of Sukkot? Why? So that the last of those who are in Eretz Yisrael on the pilgrimage to Jerusalem can reach their homes beyond the Euphrates River before the onset of rain, which would make crossing the river more hazardous. So apparently, it takes 15 days for those who came for the pilgrimage festivals to return home, not 3 days. Now here you see that ancient Israel at times extended well beyond the Jordan River, if we're talking about getting to the Euphrates River. Rav Yosef says this is not difficult. Here in the Mishnah in Tractate Tainus, Rabban Gamliel's statement is referring to the duration of the journey during the first temple period, which took 15 days, whereas there Rabbi Yehuda's statement is referring to the duration of the journey during the second temple period, which took 3 days, presumably because Israel was smaller then. Now the Gemara explains the answer. During the first temple period, when the Jewish people were very numerous, it's not about geography, it's something different. When the people were very numerous, right? In the second temple period, the population of Jews in Israel was actually much smaller than during the first temple period. And then it was shrunk drastically when the first temple was destroyed and Nebuchadnezzar forced all the Jews of Israel into the Babylonian exile. So during the first temple period, when the Jewish people were very numerous, as it is written with regard to them, 1 Kings 4:20, Judea and Israel were many, as the sand that is by the sea in multitude, eating and drinking and rejoicing. So during that period, we need that much time for them to travel from Jerusalem to the farthest reaches of the land of Israel due to the wide distribution of the large population. Well, that sounds like it is geography, but wait. During the second temple period, when the Jewish people were not very numerous, as it is written, the whole congregation together was 42,360. We do not need that much time for them to travel from Jerusalem to the farthest reaches of Eretz Yisrael due to the limited distribution of the small population. In other words, in the first temple period, there were so many Jews living in Israel, they couldn't all congregate somewhat close to Jerusalem, so they spread out over a much larger geographic area. When the exiles returned for the second temple period, they all tended to live closer to Jerusalem because there were much fewer of them, and they wanted to live, not far apart, which was dangerous when there were invaders and stuff, they would naturally tend to live closer together and congregate around what? Jerusalem. So Abaye said to Rav Yosef, but isn't it written, so the priests and the Levites and some of the people and the singers and the porters and the Gibeonites dwelt in their cities, and all Israel in their cities. Ezra 2:7. Now that's talking about the Second Temple period. And this verse indicates that despite their limited numbers, the Jewish people did not, concentrate around Jerusalem, but rather they dwelt in all the cities that they had inhabited previously. And the distance to the far reaches of Eretz Yisrael was no shorter during the Second Temple period. So if it took 15 days to travel that far during the First Temple period, it would still take 15 days during the Second Temple period. Abaye continued, and since that is the reality, that even though there was a smaller population, it was distributed all over the cities of Israel in the Second Temple period. So Abaye says, and since that is the reality, so then the opposite is reasonable. It should take longer to get home in the Second Temple period than it did in the first. Why? If they lived the same distance from Jerusalem, well, during the First Temple period, when the Jewish people were very numerous and when everyone was structured in groups and caravans could be found that traveled both during the day and during the night, we do not need that much time to travel from Jerusalem to the farthest reaches of Eretz Yisrael, and 3 days suffice. They didn't have trains and buses, but they had caravans, and the caravans were moving around frequently. You didn't have to wait for one in order to be safe when you were traveling with a group, because there were groups of people traveling all over Israel all the time because it was a much bigger population. Second Temple period, if you're going to go to a far place and you want to be safe and travel with a group of other people, you might have to wait several days until a group is heading in that direction. By contrast, during the Second Temple period, when the Jewish people were not very numerous and when everyone was not structured in groups and therefore caravans could not be found that traveled both during the day and during the night, we need that much time, i.e. 15 days, to travel from Jerusalem to the farthest reaches of Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. So Rava said, it is no different during the First Temple period and it is no different during the Second Temple period. The requisite time the requisite travel time to the border was always 15 days. As the opinion of Rabban Gamliel indicates. Nevertheless, Rabbi Yehuda calculated 3 days of travel to the border. Why? Because the sages did not wish to trouble the finder of the lost item excessively in returning the lost item by requiring him to wait an extended amount of time. How much trouble do you want somebody to go to when they're returning the lost object? Now, they're not going to wait 15 days, right? You want to make it easier for them. Ravina says, learn from the calculation of Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishna that when a finder proclaims his find, he specifies the nature of the item, i.e., or for example, he proclaims that he found a cloak. As if it enters your mind that the finder proclaims that he found a lost item without specifying its nature, you don't just say, I found something. You say the kind of thing you found. You're obviously not going to say, I found a red cloak that measures such and such, because then you've given away the distinguishing marks. But you are specifying the kind of item you found so that people who lost that kind of item can come see if you're the one holding theirs. As if it enters your mind that the finder would proclaim that he found a lost item without specifying its nature, then we would need to increase the period of time afforded to the owner to ascertain that he lost an item and add 1 day for him to examine all his vessels. So rather, learn from it that the finder proclaims that he found a cloak. And the Gemara affirms, learn from it that the finder specifies the nature of the item that he found. Rava said, even if you say that the finder proclaims that he found an unspecified lost item, nevertheless, Rabbi Yehuda does not require extending the period afforded the owner because the sages did not wish to trouble the finder excessively in returning a lost item by requiring him to wait an extended amount of time. The sages taught in a baraisa, on the first pilgrimage festival after finding the lost item, the finder proclaims his find and says, "This is the first pilgrimage festival that I am proclaiming this find." And on the second pilgrimage festival after finding the lost item, the finder proclaims his find and says, "This is the second pilgrimage festival that I am proclaiming this find." And on the third pilgrimage festival, the finder proclaims his find and says his proclamation without specification of the number of the festival. Because remember, Rabbi Yehuda required 3 times. After the third time, he doesn't have to proclaim anymore. He did his effort, right? He made his effort, reasonable effort to return the item. Now, if no one steps forward, presumably he can keep it. Although, if somebody hears that this is the guy who found it and comes around and finds him at his home, maybe he does have to return it. He just doesn't have to keep proclaiming it. The Gemara asks, and why does the finder not specify the number of the festival after the third time he's proclaiming it? Just as he specified the previous 2 festivals, let him say that this is the third pilgrimage festival. And the Gemara answers, he does not specify that it is the third pilgrimage festival, so that one who hears him will not come to confuse it with the second pilgrimage festival. If the finder were to proclaim that it is the third, shlishi, it is possible that the owner would mistakenly hear the word second, sheni, somebody yelling, and from a distance you might confuse shlishi with sheni, third with second, and believe that there is time remaining to reclaim his lost item, since on the second festival he mentions the number, and on the third festival he does not mention a number. There is no potential for confusion. And the Gemara asks, based on that reasoning, on the second pilgrimage festival too, the finder should not mention the number of the festival. Now we're on 28b, because perhaps the one who hears him will come to confuse it with the first pilgrimage festival, Rishon. So the Gemara answers, confusing the second with the first is not a problem, as in any case, won't the finder come on the third pilgrimage festival, thereby giving the owner another opportunity to recover his lost item? Another subject. The sages taught initially anyone who found a lost item would proclaim his find for 3 pilgrimage festivals and for 7 days after the last of the 3 pilgrimage festivals, so that its owner will go to his home. A trip lasting up to 3 days, and will return to Jerusalem, a trip lasting up to 3 days, and proclaim his loss for 1 day. But from the time that the temple was destroyed, may it, and it says it like this, but from the time that the temple was destroyed, may it be rebuilt speedily in our days. The sages instituted that those who find lost items shall proclaim their finds in synagogues and study halls, right? Once we decentralized ritual Judaism because there was no more holy temple, right? And the sacrifices were replaced by our prayers, right? In the synagogues and in our learning in the study halls. So then that would become the place in a town where you would proclaim lost objects. And this idea that whenever we mention the Holy Temple, we add, may it be rebuilt speedily in our days, that's how it's always referred to pretty much in the prayer book. And from the time that the oppressors proliferated, the sages instituted an ordinance that one who finds a lost item shall inform his neighbors and his acquaintances, and that will suffice for him. So we're going back to Rabbi Meir's view. That was the first view offered in our Mishnah. So the Gemara asks, what is the meaning of from the time that the oppressors proliferated? And the Gemara answers, it is from the time that they say a lost item belongs to the king. Very interesting. A lost item belongs to the king. In ancient times, laws governing the rights to a lost item varied among countries. In many countries, any treasure buried in the ground belonged not to the finder, but to the monarch. And any other lost item was divided equally between the finder and the monarchy. Under the Roman legal system, lost items belonged exclusively to the finder. And the Gemara relates an incident involving Rabbi Ami, who was initially from Babylonia, which was under Persian rule, where lost items belonged to the king. In the land of Israel, which was under Roman rule, lost items belonged to the finder. So now the incident. So the Gemara relates, Rabbi Ami found a vessel full of dinars. A certain Roman saw that Rabbi Ami was wary and hesitant to take it. And the Romans said to him, "Go, take it for yourself. We are not Persians who say that a lost item belongs to the king." And the sages taught in a Baraisa, there was a place called the Claimant's Stone in Jerusalem. And anyone who lost an item would be directed there. And anyone who found a lost item would be directed there. It was the lost and found of Jerusalem. And this would, and the finder, so the finder would stand and proclaim his find, and the owner would stand and provide its distinguishing marks and take the item. And this is the place about which we learned in a Mishna, Tractate Tainus 19a, go and see if the claimant's stone has been obscured by the rising water. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 7. Now, Mishnah number 8. If a claimant accurately stated what type of item the lost item that was found by another person is, but he did not state, i.e. he did not describe its distinguishing marks, the finder will not give it to him. And in the case of a swindler, even though he stated its distinguishing marks, the finder shall not give the lost item to him. As it is stated, and if your brother be not near to you and you know him not, then you shall bring it to your house, and it shall be with you until your brother claims, right, derosh it, and you shall return it to him. And would it enter your mind, we've said this two times already, this is the third time, would it enter your mind that the finder would give it to him before he claims it? How can the finder claim it? How can the finder return it if he does not know the identity of the owner? Rather, the verb derosh is not referring to the claim of the owner. It is referring to the scrutiny performed by the finder. You shall not return the lost item until you scrutinize shetidrosh, your brother, to determine whether he, the claimant, is a swindler or whether he is not a swindler. That's the Mishnah. Now the Gemara. It was stated that Rabbi Yehuda said, one who finds an item proclaims that he found a lost item without specifying its nature. And Rav Nachman said he specifies the nature of the item. For example, he proclaims that he found a cloak. And Rav Yehuda said one who finds an item proclaims that he found a lost item. As if you say that he proclaims that he found a cloak, we are concerned about the possibility that a swindler may attempt to claim the item. Perhaps the swindler learned that another person lost that item, and he will ascertain its distinguishing marks, provide those distinguishing marks, and claim the item. You're trying to avoid giving it to a swindler who has some of the distinguishing marks, let's say general distinguishing marks, intermediate distinguishing marks, but not clear-cut, distinct distinguishing marks. Rav Nachman said the finder proclaims that he found the cloak, and we are not concerned about the possibility that a swindler may attempt to claim the item, as if so, there is no end to the matter. Even if the finder does not specify the nature of the item, perhaps a swindler would be able to guess its nature. The Gemara cites proof from that which we learned in the Mishnah. If a claimant accurately states what type of item the lost item that was found by another is, but he did not state its distinguishing marks, the finder does not give it to him. Now, granted, if you say that the finder proclaims that he has found an unspecified lost item, this Mishnah teaches us that even though the claimant indeed stated that the lost item is a cloak, as long as he did not state its distinguishing marks, we do not return it to him. But if you say that the finder proclaims that he found a cloak, if the finder stated that he found a cloak and the claimant stated that he lost a cloak, does it need to be said that when he did not state its distinguishing marks, we do not return it to him? So Rav Safra said, actually one could say that the finder proclaims that he found the cloak, right? The general nature of what it was that was lost. And the Mishnah is referring to a case where the finder stated that he found the cloak and the claimant stated its distinguishing marks. And what is the meaning of the phrase in the Mishnah? If he did not state its distinguishing marks, it means if he did not state its clear-cut distinguishing marks, but rather stated distinguishing marks that are not exclusive to the item, therefore he has not proved its ownership, right? He might have seen that somebody lost it and somebody picked it up. And from a distance, he saw it was a red cloak. So when somebody says, I found a cloak, this guy walks up and says, the cloak that I lost was a red cloak. Well, that's too general. He has to come up with something more like, I lost a red cloak, and on the inside, there's a little hole, and that leads to the pocket that you wouldn't know unless you were the owner. The Mishnah teaches, and in the case of a swindler, even though he stated its distinguishing marks, the finder shall not give the lost item to him. So the sages taught, initially, anyone who lost an item would provide its distinguishing marks and take it. But when the swindlers proliferated, the sages instituted an ordinance that the finders will say to him, "Go and bring witnesses who can testify that you are not a swindler, and take your item." That's interesting. You're not bringing witnesses who prove that you own the item and that you lost it. You're bringing witnesses that they're character references, right, that prove that you are not a swindler. The Gemara relates, this is as in that incident involving the father of Rav Papa, who lost a donkey and others found it. He came before Rabba bar Rav Huna to reclaim his donkey. Rabba bar Rav Huna said to the father of Rav Papa, "Go and bring witnesses who can testify that you are not a swindler, and you may take the donkey." The father of Rav Papa went and brought witnesses. Rabba bar Rav Huna said to the witnesses, "Do you know about him that he is a swindler?" And the witnesses said, "Yes." Rav Papa's father said incredulously to the witnesses, "I am a swindler?" And the witnesses said to him, "We are saying that you are not a swindler." They had thought that the question was if he was not a swindler, and therefore they responded in the affirmative. They misheard, right? Like the syntax was just a little confusing to the witnesses. Is it true that this man is a swindler? They heard him say, is it true that he is not a swindler? Right? Because you would expect your witnesses come forward to say that this man is not a swindler. And they were asked, is he a swindler? So they said yes, thinking that they were being asked, is it true that he is not a swindler? Okay, you got it. So Rabba bar Rav Huna said, it is reasonable to conclude that the witnesses actually intended to support Rav Papa's father, because presumably a person does not bring condemnation upon himself. He wouldn't bring witnesses that he thinks are going to testify that he is a swindler. So Rav Papa's father would not have volunteered to provide witnesses who would testify against him. So of course we believe them when they say they were confused. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 8. Now Mishnah number 9, right? We get later in the chapter, the Mishnahs and Gemaras come quicker. If one finds any living being that works and generates enough revenue to cover the costs of the food that it eats, this is very interesting. Let's start again. If one finds any living being, meaning, what did you find? You found a sheep, you found an ox, you found a donkey, or even perhaps you found a slave, but I don't think it's a slave. I think we're talking about any kind of animal that works and generates enough revenue to cover the costs of the food that it eats. Then it shall work and eat while in the finder's possession. Remember, you find an animal, you're going to have to take care of it against the day when the one who lost it will come and claim it. You have to keep it alive. It's going to cost you money to keep that animal living. Now, if it's a work animal, like a donkey, an ox, whatever, a sheep that could be shorn, right? In other words, if you can make some money by having the animal in your possession, you'll work it and use that money to pay the costs of feeding the animal. Makes perfect sense. And any living being that does not work, but it does eat, shall be sold. As it is stated, then you shall bring it into your house, and it shall be with you until your brother claims it, and you shall return it to him, indicating that the finder must see how best to return it to him. Since the owner must repay the finder for his expenditures, if feeding the animal costs more than its value, the finder's keeping the animal in his possession will prevent the owner from recovering it, because the bill could really add up. It's actually going to be better for the owner of the lost item or the lost animal that you sell the animal and then you just hold on to the money until the owner comes and claims that, rather than rack up these exorbitant bills feeding the animal. And then when the guy finally comes to collect his animal, he can't afford to reclaim it because you spent so much money feeding it. Now, what shall be done with the money received from the sale of the animal? Rabbi Tarfon says the finder may use it. Therefore, if the money is lost, he is liable to pay restitution for it. Rabbi Kiva says he may not use the money. Therefore, if it is lost, he is not liable to pay restitution for it, right? So interesting. Rabbi Tarfon says you can use the money, right? So you can spend it, whatever you got, you just owe that amount when the guy eventually comes. So if he comes, right, you pay him that much money. Rabbi Kiva says you set it aside. It's like it's as if it's sacred because it's part of this mitzvah of returning it. I'm not saying it is sacred, but it's as if. So you put it aside and don't use it. Then, if through no fault of your own it becomes lost, stolen, etc., you're not liable to replace it. You did your best. You set it aside for the guy, it got lost. It's unfortunate, but you're not liable for it. That's Mishnah number 9. Now the Gemara. The Mishnah teaches that an animal that generates enough revenue to cover the cost of the food that it eats shall work and eat while in the finder's possession. And the Gemara asks, and must he care for the animal forever? And Rav Nachman says that Shmuel says he cares for the animal until 12 months pass. This is also taught in a Baraisa. If one finds any living being that works and generates enough revenue to cover the cost of the food that it eats, for example, a cow or a donkey, he tends to them until 12 months pass. From that point forward, one assesses their value, sells them, and places the money aside for the owner. If one finds calves and foals, which are young and unfit for labor, he tends to them for 3 months, as they do not earn their keep. From that point forward, one assesses their value, sells them, and places the money aside for the owner. If one finds geese and roosters, he tends to them for 30 days. From that point forward, one assesses their value, sells them, and places the money aside for the owner. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak says the legal status of a chicken is like that of a large domesticated animal in that the eggs it lays suffice to cover the costs of its food, and therefore the finder keeps it for 12 months. And this is also taught in Baraisa. If one finds a chicken and a large domesticated animal, he tends to them for 12 months. From that point forward, one assesses their value, sells them, and places the money aside for the owner. If one finds calves and foals, he tends to them for 30 days. From that point forward, one assesses their value, sells them, and places the money aside. If one finds geese and roosters and anything that costs more to 10 than the revenue generated by it, he tends to them for 3 days. From that point forward, assess their value, sell, and place the money aside. So the Gemara asks, this is difficult, as there is a contradiction between the ruling of the first Baraisa, that the finder keeps calves and foals for 3 months, and the ruling of the second Baraisa, that says the finder keeps calves and foals for 30 days. And the other contradiction about geese and roosters, that you keep them for 30 days in the first Baraisa, and in the second Baraisa, you keep geese and roosters for 3 days. So which is it? And the Gemara answers the contradiction between the ruling and the first Baraisa with regard to calves and foals, and the ruling in the second Baraisa with regard to calves and foals is not difficult. This ruling in the first Baraisa that the finder keeps them for 3 months is referring to calves and foals that graze in the pasture. And that ruling in the second Baraisa that the finder keeps them for 30 days is referring to calves and foals that need to be fattened and therefore require greater exertion on the part of the one who finds them. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. The contradiction between the ruling in the first Baraisa with regard to geese and roosters in one Baraisa versus geese and roosters in the others is also not difficult. This ruling in the first Baraisa that the finder keeps them for 30 days is referring to large geese and roosters, which do not require great exertion. And that ruling in the second Baraisa that you keep them for 3 days, this is referring to small geese and roosters, which require more work, not less. And the Mishnah teaches, and any living being that does not work, but it does eat, shall be sold. And the sages taught in a Baraisa, the verse states, and you shall return it to him, indicating that the finder must see how best to return it to him, meaning that one shall not feed the value of a calf to the lost calves that he is tending, nor the value of a foal to the lost foals that he is tending, nor the value of a goose to the geese that he is tending, nor the value of a rooster to the roosters that he is tending. Were the finder to do so, ultimately, the owner would receive nothing. So better, you should sell it. You know, if it's not going to pay for itself and you're going to run up these bills, better sell it now, put the money aside, and hold that for the owner when he comes forward to collect that which he lost. Thursday, we'll continue there. Tomorrow, again, the same time as today, 7 p.m. Pacific, and we'll pick it up there for page 29. Okay, questions or comments? The hour is late, so we'll try to limit the number of questions. Joe, the width would be the measure of the loom it was woven on, but the length customizes it, right? So it's easier to guess the width just by looking. But the length is what customizes garments. So you could say the width is also kind of standardized because most looms perhaps are about the same size. The length is what customizes. Thank you. Bell says a book titled, I believe, Cut My Cloth, predicated that the original looms were about the width of an animal pelt. 35 inches was the standard even when mechanical looms were developed, and the wider widths are a modern development. Very interesting. And Charles says, what if the person who lost the cloak in Jerusalem lives outside of Eretz Yisrael? Might well be. But we're just talking about kind of standardizing the number of days that somebody has to, proclaim. So, we're gonna deal with the majority of the people who are in Jerusalem on a pilgrimage festival. They came from within Eretz Yisrael. And finally, Bill, question: can a very specific color be a distinguishing mark? So a man says, "I lost a red cloak," and that's not enough. But could a person say, "I lost a cloak that was Pantone"? Hashtag FF2400 and have it be sufficient? That's a great question. Clearly not one that was in the realm of the sages, but I would imagine that now, why not? Why not? That's a very specific number, and unless it turned out that was that's actually the number of a very typical red that a lot of people have. But if it's a specific measurement for an unusual red, then I would think it would work. That's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow at 7 p.m.